Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University. I am very excited to be the moderator for the Middle East Policy Forum today. We're going to talk about the World Cup in Qatar in 2022. I'm a visiting professor in the Elliott School of International Affairs, and I am the Associate Director of the FAO program, where we do executive education classes for the Department of Defense, and I do that with Professor Joe Spear. We have great guests today. For this panel, we really couldn't have more knowledgeable people about the geopolitics of the World Cup in Qatar and the footballing sporting side as well. So let me introduce them, lay out the plan for the discussion. We really appreciate everybody being here. Feel free to put questions in the chat at any time. And after I moderate our initial discussion, we will go to Q&A. So our first guest is Ambassador Susan Ziade, who had a 23-year career with the U.S. Department of State. She most recently served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Arabian Peninsula Affairs. She was the acting principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs, and she's a career member of the Senior Foreign Service. She was U.S. Ambassador to the State of Qatar between 2011 and 2014, Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh, and was the official spokesperson for the U.S. Embassy Baghdad. She was also Deputy Chief of Mission in Bahrain and was posted to Riyadh, Kuwait, Amman, and Jerusalem. When she was in Washington, responsible for the Jordan desk, our own Ambassador Skip Ghanim, who usually directs the Middle East Policy Forum, he's on sabbatical this year, what was in Jordan. So they had a very close working relationship during that time. And she's a decorated diplomat. She won the State Department Superior Honor Award numerous times, the Edward R. Murrow Award for Excellence in Public Diplomacy, also from the Department of State. And the Secretary of Defense awarded her the Department of Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service in 2015. The Mayor of Qatar also awarded her the Amiri Sash of Merit in 2014. She was intimately involved at the highest levels in planning for the Cup. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the Elliott School, Ambassador Ziade. Thank you for making time. Great. And then our second guest is, as I see it, the leading scholar on the World Cup in Qatar in the world, Professor Daniel Reisha, who is a visiting professor at Georgetown University in Qatar. He is also a tenured professor of comparative politics at the American University in Beirut. And his work is on energy as well as sport policy and politics. He is the author of Success and Failure of Countries at the Olympic Games, which was published in 2016 by Routledge, as well as many other publications and a whole raft of articles about the World Cup in Qatar. He is the faculty lead at Georgetown, Qatar, on Building a Legacy, Qatar FIFA World Cup 2022. Welcome, Professor Reisha. Thank you so much for making time to be with us.
Yeah, thank you, Graham, for including me in this exciting panel.
So we're going to organize the discussion in three parts. We're going to talk about how Qatar got the World Cup, the legacy of the World Cup so far, and at the end, we're going to do some kind of predictions and about the geopolitics of the Gulf region and how Qatar fits into that, and also about the Cup itself. So I wanted to start with Ambassador Ziade, if she can kind of talk about how Qatar got the Cup, why they were interested, if she can lay the geopolitical landscape that this question fits into for us, at the same time that I'll also invite you to talk about your experience coordinating with the Qataris in the early planning stages for the Cup. And then we'll go to Professor Reisha after that. Please, Ambassador.
It's a pleasure to be with you today and with our esteemed colleagues, and particularly with Daniel, who I've read a lot of his work, and I'm just amazed at all of the work that has been done on this subject. I don't have that kind of background on it, but I was there on the ground doing a lot of this work, and I can speak to that. But before I do, I'd really like to go into the geopolitics of the history of Qatar's development for the last 25 years, and to understand how this leads up to why the World Cup is important to Qatar. Because if you can't understand this, you can't understand how Qatar acts, reacts, positions itself as a nation. So we have to look at their broader engagement globally. First of all, first and foremost, Qatar is a small country. It's the size of Connecticut. It's positioned on the tip of the Arabian Peninsula, like a thumb sticking out in the Persian Gulf. And in that sense, they have Saudi Arabia to their west and Iran to their east. So the whole pursuit of security has been first and foremost in the minds of the Qataris really since the birth of the nation, but certainly since 1971 when the British withdrew from the Arabian Peninsula. So as part of their strategy, the pursuit of security and visibility by developing networks globally with reliable partners, contacts in different continents. And I think if you look at the history of Qatar, you really see that under the father Emir, who is the father of the current Emir, beginning in the late 1990s, this is when he took over in 1995, this was his ambition. He understood the country's vulnerability and he was determined to figure out how to move it forward and secure it. So I like to talk about sort of a three-sided stool and how you look at Qatar and the three foundational bases for Qatar. And number one was the development of liquefied natural gas. This is the economic platform that launched Qatar and its relations with foreign countries that invested in it. BP was originally there, threw a lot of money into it, never figured out how to make it work and withdrew. And luckily ExxonMobil, a US company I will note, although at that time Mobil came in and with other companies developed the technology and started developing the production of LNG and the establishment of the trains. And if you are aware, the LNG markets initially were really the US, Europe, and then increasingly Asia. So unlike today, where Asia is seen as the big market up until the recent Ukraine issue, really Qatar was reaching out across the globe in terms of markets for their LNG. So that's point number one. Point number two is the launch of Al Jazeera and the strengthening of Qatar's soft power and their messaging. This was a critically important mechanism, not only in the Arab world, but in the Islamic world and beyond, as Al Jazeera's programming became more widely seen and with the advent of satellite TV in many countries around the globe. So we have economic power, we have soft power. And the third, which often does get ignored, but is important, is the military power or the security. Now, their own forces are small. They have more recently been putting more money and development and training and recruitment into their military. But the most important date, I think, was 2002, when El Udeid opened up to the American forces that transferred their base from Saudi Arabia to El Udeid. It is now the forward headquarters for our Central Command. It is the headquarters for the Air Force component of the US Air Force for the Middle East. And it has provided a security not only for US interests in the region, but as a deterrent force for any outside elements that would try to encroach upon Qatar. And there has been a growing, developing relationship between the US military and the Qatari military in that regard. So security, economic, soft power. And then I think the only other factor I would mention of that period is the dramatic rise of Qatar Airways, which was important for many reasons. Of course, connectivity to different parts of the world. When I was sitting in Qatar as ambassador, I was always fascinated to see where Akbar al-Bakr was going to open a new route, because that told me economic development, diplomatic ties were soon to follow. Really their growth in terms of branding and how to make people understand what is Qatar and where it is. Because in many ways, in the mid-90s, Qatar was less developed than some of the other Gulf countries. And to be able to catch up, they had to attract talent, attract not US companies, companies from around the world, and develop their own capabilities internally. So Qatar Airways had one way of bringing more elements back into Qatar, creating traffic going in different ways, and also helping to strengthen the other three elements of economic security and soft power messaging. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, and can we ask you to talk about your own role in the process as well?
All right, I was ambassador from 2011 to 2014. The World Cup had been won by the Qataris. What I saw as my role in many ways was to help introduce the Qataris to how we do things in the US. Now, I know it's true that, and my colleague Daniel will say, well, Europe, Germany, UK, others have a much longer history in football, or what we in America call soccer. But for purposes of this discussion, I will become continental and call it football. But the fact of the matter is that I wanted to introduce them to a whole host of issues that would support their legacy issues, meaning how you meld entertainment, sport, and media in ways that promote Qatar as a brand, promote the World Cup, create a legacy. And certainly the Americans are very good at that. And we did one road trip starting in Los Angeles. There's no better place for sport there, whether it was looking at stadiums, looking at how stadiums are donated afterwards, looking at how you preserve film. We visited, for example, Deluxe, one of the foremost companies of preservation of film for posterity for the state of Qatar, looking at environmental issues, lead construction in stadiums. We took them to Atlanta, where they visited with the CDC and learned issues of health calamities and pandemics in large mass gatherings. Little did we know we would be dealing with COVID, but that was an initial intro to Turner Broadcasting at CNN and their sports division to look at how sports can be sprung off, but linked to their whole media apparatus, which of course beIN Sports did become for Al Jazeera. In Miami, in Atlanta, looking at legacy from the Olympics, how they did security, what they did with buildings in Atlanta, like sports complexes and swimming complexes, and how they were donated and repurposed. All of these were legacy issues that the team wanted to look at and figure out how to then take ideas and adopt them and adapt them, really. Adapt them is a more accurate word for Qatar. So we did 2 trips, and I was also pleased to say the project management for the whole World Cup went to a US firm, which I was pleased about.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. Professor Reisha, can we bring you in on this question of sort of how and why Qatar got the World Cup and why they were interested, please?
So I think, first of all, that was an excellent introduction by Ambassador Ziade. And so Qatar, as she said, is a very small country. And the main objective of small countries in global affairs is to become visible. And Qatar started investing into sport since the early 1990s, when it hosted an ATP tennis tournament, and then it hosted a variety of annual sporting events, of continental championships, global championships. 2006, the Asian Games were a milestone. 2015, Team Handball World Cup, which is a big sport in Europe. 2019, the Athletics World Championships, and now the World Cup. But there are more than 100 sporting events all over the year. And this helped Qatar to become visible, which is the major goal of small states. But small states choose different strategies to become visible. Some might try to become a tourist destination, others location for financial services, others by doing lots of humanitarian aid and so on. But Qatar's niche is that Qatar found is sport. And the visibility serves the purpose to be on the map and to punch above its weight in global affairs. But also, as Ambassador Ziade said, to contribute to national security, because we need to know, all of you who have not worked much on Qatar so far, you should really have a look on the map. And then you see how tiny Qatar is, and that it's surrounded by 3 huge countries. One of them is Saudi Arabia, and the other one is Iran. And the nightmare of Qatar is that it would happen what happened to Kuwait in the early 1990s when it was invaded by Iraq. So these sports investments are not just about branding and punching above its weight in global affairs, but also a tool to build relations with as many people and countries in the world to contribute to national security. And some of you might have followed that there was a blockade from June 2017 until January 2021 by a group of countries led by Saudi Arabia. And the World Cup might have helped to prevent an invasion and to survive this difficult time. So national security, visibility, branding, being influential in global affairs, that are, I believe, the main motives. And sport is important, but yes, Susan mentioned Al Jazeera and Qatar Airways. These are state companies that belong to the states that are used to achieve the general policy objectives. And of course, in the long run, it's also about diversifying the economy, which largely depends on exporting LNG. I mean, what we do here in Education City, Georgetown and other American universities is part of that, to contribute to the diversification of the economy. But it also comes back to security. Just 2 days ago, Germany signed an energy partnership with Qatar. Qatar is so far mainly exporting LNG to Asian countries, particularly to India, China, and South Korea. And now with the Russian-Ukraine war, many European countries want to become independent from Russian gas and are keen to develop relationships with other countries. And this is a window of opportunity for Qatar to also build closer relationships with countries in Europe. So, but the diversification aspect, I believe, is also important. Sport is just one part of it. What we do here in Education City is another one of it. It has become much more easier foreign ownership, for example, of companies. Foreigners can obtain a long-term residence when they buy property. So there's really a lot of changes happening in the country, which I believe we will discuss more in detail.
Right, thank you both for that. So this link between soft power and security is really important. So I want to go back to the 90s and think about these 2 threats that you mentioned, Saudi Arabia and Iran. How have those, how has the perception of those threats evolved over time in Qatar? And is it perhaps worthwhile to compare and contrast those? And I'll start with Ambassador Ziade.
That's actually a tough question. Look, for the Qataris, the relationship with Saudi Arabia is important. Even during the blockade, that was the relationship that bothered them, I think, the most. I've never heard it articulated, but I know it's important. There are a lot of ties with Saudi Arabia in terms of economic ties. It's their only land border. A lot of food and products come across that border. They are of a Wahhabi background. The Al Thani are from the greater tribes that come from the Najd area of central Saudi Arabia. There are lots of marriages between Qataris and Saudis. So all of these ties and historical links had an impact on the Qataris in that way. And I think you even see today, after the rapprochement, that maybe the one country in the Gulf where the rapprochement is on the most firm ground at the moment is Saudi Arabia. So that is important. Now, Iran, they share the gas fields. That's important. So geography links them, economics links them, and that can't be ignored. That said, they don't have production with Iran. Their production is separate. And actually, for quite a number of years, their relations were always fine with Iran, but I'm not sure I would say they were as close as, let's say, Oman's were. Where things changed, of course, were with the embargo and Iran opening up their airspace to Qatar Airways and opening up their airspace to be able to bring in food and supplies and any kind of logistics initially to Qatar. And also their ports being used as a transit to bring in goods to Qatar was a lifeline for them. They don't always agree politically, but their relationship certainly has gotten stronger. It's ironic, actually, when you think that this was a complaint from the Saudis and the Emiratis. So today, I would have to say those two relations are both important, but for different historical reasons and different reasons going forward.
Great. Professor Reisha.
Yeah, I concur with what Susan said, and it's true that many tribes are transnational. We should not forget that. And so when we look at security, I mean, the major life insurance is a US military base, but there are also some thousand Turkish soldiers in the country since 2017 when the blockade started. Turkey and Qatar initiated a security partnership. And so that's another part. But when we look at security, I think we cannot just look at like number of US or Turkish soldiers in the country. It's more complex. LNG is a major security tool, the contracts with different countries. Qatar, by the way, also during the blockade, continued providing gas to the UAE, for example, and Egypt. And in general, what Qatar is doing is what we call in political science hedging. So they are also friends with the enemies of their friends. So they do not only have excellent relations with the US, and President Biden just called Qatar a major non-NATO ally partner. I hope I got it right. I think this hedging strategy really paid off when now the crisis in Afghanistan happened, because Qatar helped evacuating 10,000s of people from Afghanistan, and also many embassies, such as the American or the German, have relocated from Kabul to Doha. So security is more complex again than just the soldiers that are being based here. But of course, this is the most important life insurance for Qatar, having this US military base here.
Thank you both for that. So I have another follow-up question on this first part of the discussion about how Qatar got the cup. I think the word corruption became associated with Qatar's bid from the very beginning, and in many ways, this seemed to me unfair. There's, Professor Reisha, so please, and then we'll go to Ambassador Ziade. Yes, sir.
Yeah. So I want to make a very general statement on this as a political science professor. I think there are governance systems that are more or less likely to produce corruption. In the world governing body of football, FIFA, there were 24 men, the executive committee of FIFA, making the decision who would get the next World Cup. And if you have such a small number of people, 24 people who make a decision, of course, this is a system very tempting for corruption. So it seems that in the past, when the next World Cup host was selected, corruption was common, and even around the World Cup bid of a successful World Cup bid from Germany for the 2006 World Cup, and I'm a German and very proud of the World Cup 2006 in Germany. It was, I think, a beautiful event. But you know, as we know now, there was a bribing involved in the decision-making process. And so I think if there's something good that came out of the allegations, corruption allegations around the Qatari bid, is that the entire system in FIFA has changed. And from now on, the entire FIFA General Assembly votes for the next World Cup host. So instead of just 24 old men, we have now 211 federations who have a say. And for the 2026 World Cup, which will be hosted by the US, Canada, and Mexico, for the first time, this new system was in place. And the US got 130 something votes, and Morocco got 664, 65 votes. So I think this process will lead to less corruption in the future. And the old system was very tempting for corruption, since so few people made the decision. And yes, it's a bit unfair to bring this up, since this was nothing Qatar specific. There were most likely bribery around many other bids in the past.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Ziade, can I bring you in on this point?
Well, actually, I would have to say that my colleague Daniel summed it up succinctly, and that's really where I would come out. The only other thing I would say is, after the Cup, as contracting and companies were jockeying for position to build on the success of the bid itself, at least from a US standpoint, we were very carefully monitoring it from a Department of Commerce perspective, and we never saw anything after the bid that would indicate any malfeasance at all.
Thank you very much. And that's a great segue to the second part of our discussion. What is the legacy of Qatar's World Cup so far? So have they achieved their strategic goals in securing a World Cup? We could talk about labor issues, bad press, and Qatar's management of these controversies. And sort of broadly, I'm curious about, what does this all tell us about the nature of the Qatari state? Ambassador Ziade, I'll go to you first.
Okay, well, Daniel touched on quite a bit of this earlier. I think I would just like to lay out a few points about where the Qataris were going with the issue of sport to begin with, and how they were looking at their future and how sport fit into this. I think this is what I would say. I mean, over the past 15 years, really, sports have been central in Qatar's global branding. They have tried to inculcate a culture of sports and fitness in Qatar as well. And we saw this very much. And a lot of this precedes even the World Cup bid. As Daniel mentioned, the hosting of the Asian Games in 2006, which was quite a feather in their cap. Not only to have won it, but to have been able to pull it off in a way that reflected very positively upon Qatar. They established their Aspire Academy, which is a sports training academy, as early as 2008, when it was launched. They were looking for public spaces for sports and exercise for residents in Qatar, walking paths and green spaces and different opportunities for team sports, something that had not been as much a part of the widespread Qatari culture. Yes, focus on football was always there, following leagues was always there, but how you take the family out on a Friday afternoon and really do some kind of sports activity, or how you work it into your daily life, in Qatar was a new phenomenon that we saw was being encouraged by the government. There were also things like the Vision 2030, which was launched in 2008, which had an emphasis on economic diversification and the environment as well. And sports was part of that, of economic diversification. And as part of that 2030, this was the blueprint for how infrastructure was being developed, some of which preceded the bid. I think this is important to note. For example, the Hamad International Airport that opened in 2014 preceded the bid. The expansion, the new Hamad port, which expanded the capacity for the Qataris to be able to bring in deep water ships for larger cargoes, which was hugely important, particularly during the embargo when it finally came online. And then, of course, after the bid, the expansion of roads and the metro, et cetera. But since the bid, you see even more steps that the country has taken to inculcate this sense of sports and fitness. The National Sports Day, which started, I think, in 2012, I was ambassador at the time, and how companies in the private sector as well as government offices would take a national holiday and bring in all their staff and their families to do sports activities as part of a national culture. This was very specifically done. Daniel mentioned the hosting of international sporting events like the ATP tennis, World and Track, and others. I used to love going to the tennis matches. Where else could you see Nadal and Novak and others, playing sports? It was wonderful. Again, the launch of the BN Sports channel, which created further branding and economic diversification, which was in 2012. And then we come to the sticky issue of labor. So before we get to labor, I do have quite a bit to say. I'd rather turn it over to my colleague to make his remarks, and then maybe we can turn to the issue of labor.
Perfect.
Yeah,
Reisha,
so I think, since Susan has been in Doha 2011 to 2014, that if she comes now here, that the city has so much change, so it's undergoing such a rapid change. And the overall objective of Qatar and the Qatar national vision is to become an advanced country by 2030. And I think when it comes to the infrastructure, when it comes to education, Qatar has come quite far. Certainly, changing a culture takes more time. So we can see obstacles, for example, when it comes to women's sports. So I think most of my female students do sports, but not all of their families would be happy if they do it in front of men. So I interviewed once a former coach of the Qatari national football team, and she said it was a bit frustrating because she would go to the schools and scout the girls and invite them to come to the practice of the national team, but their families would then not accept the invitation because national teams means to play in front of men. It might be televised, pictures might be taken. And so these changes, they will come, but they need more time. So, and this is always a phrase I'm using, you can change an infrastructure overnight, but not a culture. But the country is doing really a lot, and the National Sports Day is a great example. All the public spaces, the parks that were created is a great example. I also would like to talk about labor issue, because I think when we say what's the legacy of the World Cup, or when we ask the question, how did the World Cup change Qatar? I think we cannot give like a general answer. We need to look at it issue by issue. And I think when the World Cup was awarded to Qatar, certainly the most discussed topic were the living and working conditions of the migrant workers, which I believe were at that time really not good, and the entire system in place was rightfully criticized. But I believe a lot of changes have happened in this area. But again, I think we cannot make a general statement. We need to look at it issue by issue. But when we talk about labor market, I think a lot of changes have happened, which should be recognized.
Great, thank you very much. Let's go to Ambassador Ziade, please.
Yes. It is true I was ambassador from 2011 to 2014, but was also the Deputy Assistant Secretary responsible for the Arabian Peninsula. So I traveled to Qatar quite a bit until 2016, and then several times since then. And you're quite right, Daniel, the change has been phenomenal. Roads go to different places now, and I have to rethink my driving when I get there. But I have to say that on the labor issue, very early on, certainly as a U.S. embassy position, we talked to the Supreme Committee about the labor issue, and the Ministry of Labor and the Prime Minister. There wasn't a person we didn't talk to about this. And the Supreme Committee recognized, they anticipated the scrutiny. They knew very clearly that this was going to be an issue, but more than that, and to give them really credit, they wanted to lead the region in this labor reform, and they wanted to use the CUP as a mechanism for doing so, even though they knew that there would be some resistance from the business community because it would have an impact. If you look at some of the early efforts, I remember visiting with the Prime Minister one day, and he was showing me, for example, here are pictures of the new housing we're building. Here are some of the safety efforts we're taking. Here are the food halls. Here are some of the electronic salary payments. They were doing some things, but it wasn't systemic enough. They were trying to tackle it piecemeal as opposed to systemically. And that's when they started to really realize that they had to have more of a blueprint. And in 2013, when I was ambassador, they brought in a labor team from DLA Piper, actually out of their London office. And they were asking them for, and I had, lots of time to meet with these guys, one of whom actually I knew from a previous life. And they were tasked with doing analysis and creating a roadmap for labor reform based on ILO standards. And so the Qataris then started to look at this and figure out how they needed to move forward, even though they knew the business community was going to be the biggest stumbling block. And then in 2017, with the establishment of the ILO project office in Qatar, we start to see some movement and some real clear steps that are being taken, because now there was another mechanism, which, by the way, the Qataris invited to come in, invited them to be there and to stay there to help them with this. And it's the only country in the Gulf where that was the case. There were a number of steps taken. Maybe I'll leave it to Daniel to outline some of those steps, and then I can jump in.
Yeah, I think maybe one could argue that it took too long until the changes happened. But the changes happened. So Qatar is the first country in the region that initiated a minimum wage. And according to the ILO, this increased from one day to another the wage of more than 200,000 workers in the country. The kafala system was dismantled. So workers don't need any more approval by their employer when they want to switch jobs or when they want to leave the country. And what I find most remarkable is that since this year, the hours in summer have been extended where outside work is not permitted anymore. So from June 1st until mid of September, it's not allowed to work outside anymore from 10 a.m. to 3:30 p.m. And I think that's really important, because everybody who has been here in summer, it's really, really warm. And for me, it's already like challenging to go from the metro station to our building. It's just like 300-400 meters. And if you imagine to do like outside work the whole day. So I think this is really remarkable. And this is what I want to criticize a bit when I look at critical media article. They usually compare Qatar with their home country. But I think we need to compare Qatar with other countries in the region. And when we compare Qatar with other countries in the Gulf, they really have become a pioneer. And I would be glad if Saudi Arabia or UAE, if they would follow the Qatari reforms, because Qatar is really now a pioneer and has improved the living and working conditions of many people. Is Qatar now a perfect place? No. I just had a lunch today with one of our cleaners, since we have here a program established at Georgetown. It's called Hoya's Meetup, where we would meet service providers. So I just had lunch with him, and of course, what I learned from him was 4 people in a room to live, etc. Is not perfect, and there's still plenty of opportunities to improve, particularly the living conditions, because I think at the workplace now the legal framework has really improved, and the government is also keen to implement it. There have been thousands of fines this summer for companies who did not implement the new rules. So thousands of companies have been fined. There have been inspections all over the country. So the government is really committed to the new reforms. But of course, there is still every improvement is a process, and this process has just started, and there's still a lot to do. But I think the country is really committed to improve the living and working conditions of the migrant worker, be it because of external pressure or domestic pressure. That's a different question. It might be a mix, because I think there are really many people. I met many Qatari people who are committed to the changes. Of course, there's also some resistance, but of course, the awarding of the World Cup and then the negative reporting in the international media, particularly on that issue, certainly has contributed to all these changes. And I think it's really important that these changes are recognized, because if there's always just criticism, it's not motivating those who are advocates for change. So the improvements have to be recognized, and of course, also there needs to be an open discussion which challenges remain. And my last remark is, Susan already mentioned the ILO office in Qatar, which is here since 2018, and they came here initially for a 3-year period. This was now renewed for another 3-year period, and I think this really shows that the government is serious about change by bringing in the ILO, and I think the ILO is doing a great job to support the government to reform its labor laws.
Great, thank you so much. Ambassador, did you want to add something to this discussion?
Just a couple of points. Recently, actually, was in the news just a couple of days ago. 12 manpower companies were shut down in Qatar for violations. The manpower companies tend to be one of the places where some of the greatest issues do arise and greatest violations. And the fact that they shut them down as opposed to penalties, I thought was important. The other thing is, it has been interesting to me to watch the engagement between the government and international NGOs and local institutions as they've tried to work through this program. It hasn't been just a diktat from above, or it has been a sort of symbiotic, collaborative effort that I think has been unique in terms of moving this issue forward with all the stakeholders at least having some say. I know the workers are still finding their footing in that, but they have been given opportunities, and hopefully there will be given more opportunities to be able to work through these issues.
Great. And so just to round out this phase of the discussion, I'm curious if there's something like an internal Qatari view or views about the legacy of this soft power strategy. Is this seen as very successful? It seems like the blockade made Qatar's emphasis on soft power seem prescient. So, Ambassador, please.
Well, I think that it certainly did help them to have all the ties that they had, and also they were smart economically about how they went about it. In the first few weeks, I know it was difficult, particularly the stress on the banking sector, but the government had the deep pockets to be able to help the banking sector on that score. They created much more economic diversification by developing some of their own light industries, agriculture, probably the dairy products. Baledna is the best example. And then also looking at other sourcing for products from different countries, different routes, different thinking about where products could come from. And I think that really helped them in terms of their branding. In the end, I think there was a bit of the David and Goliath, and they were seen as being encroached upon by all sides, and they handled it very, very well, I must say.
Great. Professor Reisha.
Well, I mean, as we discussed earlier, many families are transnational. So this blockade caused a lot of harm on people. It separated families and even couples, and it was really a tragedy. And I mean, the blockade totally failed because the blockading countries had unrealistic demands, such as shutting down Al Jazeera. And at the end, I think it helped Qatar and for example, as Susan said, to develop more national products. So I buy a lot of items in the supermarket with a stamp made in Qatar, the milk, the yogurt, also some fruits. So this helps them to become less dependent of other countries. And overall, I think what Qatar did well is that they did not retaliate. So they continued delivering gas to the UAE and to Egypt. They followed international law. They looked for international institutions to express their concerns and protest against violations of international law. And I think they gained a lot of respect by the international community, how they were dealing with this critical situation.
Great, thank you so much. And that sets us up really nicely for the third phase of our discussion. And we have some questions in the chat that dovetail really nicely with what we're going to do to close out, which is just talk about the Cup, predictions for the Cup, and what this all bodes for the geopolitics of the Gulf region and the world. So I'll start with Professor Reisha. Graham Cornwell's asked about the participation of Saudi Arabia and Iran in the tournament. Does that create any openings for broader diplomatic relations across the region? And Rachel Schaefer has asked about neutrality, political neutrality, and sports, and how the boycott of Russia's participation in international competitions may signal some kind of change. So, Professor Reisha, anything you want to tell us about what's going to happen starting this November? Yeah, we'd love to hear into politics, please.
We of course, there will be dynamics which are difficult to predict, but just imagine we have Saudi and Iranian fans here in the country who will meet and interact with each other. I think that's a terrific opportunity, but it's very difficult, of course, to make predictions. But I think at the moment the Qatari-Saudi relations are developing very well, differently to the Qatari-UAE relations, and UAE is following more and more an own agenda and approach. They were just hosting the Syrian president some days ago, for example. They have this normalization agreement with Israel. So there are many areas where Qatar and UAE are different from each other. So at the moment, it seems that the relations with Saudi develop well. And honestly, I think from Qatar should really try to collaborate with Saudi Arabia also in the realm of sports. So maybe by co-hosting events in the future, etc. I think that would be a good idea to contribute to the national security.
Great, thank you so much, Ambassador Ziade.
I would concur with everything that has been said. I think that sport will continue to be important as a way of reaching countries and bringing together countries. Like Daniel said, Iran and Saudi Arabia at the same venue will be important. I would note that I assume that Israelis will be coming there as well. That will be an interesting development to see how that handles. Israeli athletes have participated before in Doha, and that can be done without a Abraham Accord agreement between countries, which Qatar has said quite strongly that they will not be considering at this time. So I think that the Qataris have positioned themselves well. The geopolitics of the region are interesting as we're watching the UAE hosting Bashar al-Assad, moving closer to China in some ways, at least diplomatically. And Russia, right, in terms of the positions that they've taken recently in votes at the UN. I will say, having talked to some of my colleagues at the UN, much to their, I won't say surprise, but they really were a bit surprised by the abstention by the UAE. But that said, I think that it bears watching the different great powers. I'm not going to say it's a great power competition, but there are great powers that are trying to get their hooks in the region for different reasons. The Qataris have one issue with Russia, and that's gas. They don't have the whole host of other issues that the UAE has with Russia, for example, Syria or Libya. But the Qataris do have the issue of gas, whether it's pricing, supply, demand, and that will mean that they have to sort of keep all folks on board, but that has not stopped them from being critical of the position in the Ukraine, much to their credit.
Thank you. Professor Reisha, would you like to add anything to this geopolitical bit?
I can say something on the question on Russia and Ukraine. I was last night on Inside Story, which is a flagship program of Al Jazeera, just discussing this question on the boycott of Russian athletes. And overall, I would say that the international architecture of sports just works if everybody meets and competes with each other, regardless of ideology, politics, religion, etc. And so in general, I'm not in favor of sporting boycotts, but I think we have here an exceptional situation. And I compared it a bit with, so in 1948, Germany and Japan were excluded from the Olympics as a punishment for the Second World War. And I think now Russia is excluded to prevent the Third World War. So I think this is an exceptional situation. And I think that the exclusion of FIFA from the World Cup qualification, from Russia from the World Cup qualification is the right thing. Done. What should have FIFA done? Because Poland, Sweden, and Czech Republic, who might have faced Russia in the qualification, said they won't play them. So they had only two options: to exclude them or to exclude Russia. I think was the right thing to do, to exclude Russia. But of course, I've discussed this a lot with my students, and many of them argue that there are double standards because other human rights violations, particularly those towards the Palestinian people, are not addressed in a similar way. And of course, I would say my students have a point. But again, it's an exceptional situation, and I think it's the right thing to do to exclude Russia from the World Cup qualifying. Of course, like intellectually, it's difficult to say where to draw the line. And there are other sports, like, for example, in tennis, where I would associate individual athletes not that much with a country, and rather, they are kind of their own brand. So I'm not sure whether Russian tennis players should be now excluded from Wimbledon. This is another discussion. But again, we are in an exceptional situation, and sporting federations just try to do what they can do.
Great. So unfortunately, we have to leave it there, but let's give a virtual round of applause to our panelists. And so I thank them first and foremost, Ambassador Susan Ziade, Professor Daniel Reisha, for making time to speak with us. I must also acknowledge the support of ExxonMobil and the labor that went into making this panel possible. Thank you to Rachel Schaefer, first and foremost, and to Graham Cornwell. And thank you to the audience for making time to be here. And we appreciate you joining the Middle East Policy Forum, and everybody take care. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Graham. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks so much.